Thank you very much. I would like to ask my two other speakers to come back to the podium and to get ready for the Q&A. I initially thought I'd give the two of you a little break to rest and start with the questions to you, Richard. So just settle in. I have questions now through our CR, cofast.com, and also through the poll tool, and I'm trying to combine everything, and would like to start with Europe. So Richard, the first question is to you. Please touch on your impression of the Brexit and the impact on the UK economy.
Well, I should start by saying I've been away from the UK for 25 years, so I'm not sure I'm that close to it. But certainly last summer when the vote took place, I was disappointed because I've grown up with the opening up of Europe and the UK. That's a sort of personal view, and I'm disappointed to see it moving the other direction. But I did quite a lot of research because I felt it was important to try and understand, even though my colleagues elsewhere were writing about it. And it seems to me that I couldn't find any, once you try to analyze the different bits, I can't find any reason why it does anything other than harm the UK economy quite significantly, at least in the short to medium term. But so far, you haven't seen that, but Brexit hasn't happened yet.
Right.
So the vote has happened, but the event has not happened. We don't know what the event exactly will look like, but it seems to me the UK had the best possible, in terms of trade with Europe, UK had the best possible deal it could possibly have as part of the EU, with a big rebate that other countries don't get, with the separate currency that no other country will ever get again, with a border control, membership, along with the continuation of having a border control if you care about that kind of thing. So it flummoxes me how anybody thought you could ever get a better deal than you had already. And I think it will hurt. It hasn't hurt a lot yet, but I think it will hurt quite a lot. And I don't have numbers to put around that, I apologize. But
thank you, Richard, and I think you're in good company. I see Peter nodding. You agree with that opinion and with that statement, I guess.
Well, sure. I mean, I think part of the difficulty that poor Mark Carney faced in the aftermath was that he did what no economist should do, and that is predict an event and also predict the timing of the event. So I believe ultimately he is very right in terms of the negative impact for the economy, but the investment function, which is really what we should be keeping our eyes on here, is not something that reacts immediately. You have investments that have already been committed that were predicated on a no Brexit situation. And so the momentum of those will carry you forward. And as Richard has said, there is no policy right now, so there's nothing to react to. And so this is a dangerous moment when I believe the day after impact that London itself felt, which was in a state of utter shock, is the way to characterize how businesses that are investing in the United Kingdom are feeling at the moment and acting. And so those are all delayed impacts, but I would have to agree very much with Richard's assessment that this doesn't look like anything except a negative for the UK.
Thank you very much. Michelle, the next question goes to you, and it's actually not the Brexit.
Oh.
We have a new term. No, let's be quicker. We have a new term, and it's the Frexit. So how likely is France to exit the European Union? What do you think? Would you like to comment on it? Or would
Yes,
you like...
no, I will. But first I'm going to facts on Brexit and comment. We're seeing money capitals in terms of flows from London to Paris, which we would have expected to be Frankfurt. Could take it 10 years. So that's just an interesting fact. Don't know why, but that's where we're seeing it. Our view is that it will hurt both Europe and the UK, but the UK more. That said, my apologies to my fellow Canadian here. I've gone through 2 referendums in Canada before I decided to forego allegiance to Her Majesty the Queen and join the United States. And I'm just going to say that, of course, it's going to be damaging, but it's always interesting to see how business is overly confident in any sort of stability. And we saw that with Turkey. Not to compare anything to that, but business is going to say, oh, stability, anything. Of course, it will have a cost, but will it destroy the UK, or of course not. So that was that. Now, back to that, I just had to respond. The one about France. Well, our numbers indicate that if you look at the underlying trends, the sentiments that we're seeing is very strong. If you look at the, I was just reading, and it was just a killing in Paris, and this is the kind of event that could turn the election, depending on the specifics. At this point, our default scenario is not that there will be a French exit, but certainly it would be the end of the EU, in our opinion.
Thank you very much.
And if I may, sorry.
Go ahead.
Just another fact. That is also the view. I was discussing this with some folks at the central bank, and in the NATO intelligence world, it's very interesting to look at the views of central bankers versus other groups. And there's no contingency planning being made within the U.S. government as to a French exit.
But there are two outsiders, right, on both left and right in the election, either of whom is kind of, interestingly, on the far left and the far right. Either one might be somebody to hold a referendum in France.
Mélenchon is not in our, I was speaking with some French friends, and Mélenchon is not in our polls in terms of, we don't see that as a real candidate, but of course everything can change. Any of you who haven't seen John Oliver over the weekend on French exit, you have to.
I haven't seen
Very good.
Okay, we haven't touched on a couple of other countries, so I would like to ask or read the next question to you, which is very general. Destabilization has been a theme for the past year with Brexit, Trump, Russia's interference in elections, tension with China, unrest in South America, and so on. Do you expect the world to continue to destabilize or not? And how will this affect the global economy? Who would like to take that question first?
Well, I don't mind wading into it. Okay with everybody?
No, we don't mind either. Go ahead.
So my prayers very much are that, here's where I'm coming from. I told you what my bias was already, that really it is the economy that drives the political winds at this particular point in time. So you ask people to wait 7 years, they're not going to be very happy. So consider this, the opportunity cost of activism rises as growth rises inside of the economy. That's a clever way of saying, people just don't have the time to get involved in negative activism when they're gainfully employed inside of the economy. Those two things go very much together. And PhD theses have been written on, what unemployment rate threshold actually is sufficient to bring about insurrection inside of an economy, and 20% is supposed to be that threshold rate, whatever. That is the truism inside an economy. Gainfully employ people, engage them in the economy, give them something meaningful to do, and everything quietens down. So the answer to the question is it's all contingent on whether growth actually comes back or not. If growth comes back, it's a great elixir in the economy. Settles down the destabilization, enables us to get on with our lives. And by the way, I disagree with all of you in that poll result there, so I'm pretty hard-headed, I guess, here, in the sense that automation isn't the great threat that we think it's going to be. Automation is actually going to be an answer for an aging population economy if we actually get growth going again. The bigger threat, the biggest threat out there, as far as I'm concerned, is protectionism, because that kills the growth story and perpetuates destabilization.
Thank you very much. Anyone who wants to chime in?
You haven't talked yet.
Otherwise, I can...
I see protectionism as also something really negative, and all this discussion that Mexico was responsible for removing the employment or in manufacturing or if automation is the result. I think this is a shift into, as the economy gets more developed, we have a shift of the kind of employment to something with a higher value added. So you can't change this tendency. At the end of the day, this is positive because because people want to have a cheap iPhone that is produced outside and so on. People don't see the consequences of this, and this is really important. People only when the employment rate is high that they start to react. So even these big words, like when we had the Brexit, people got shocked because no one was expecting this. But again, I also agree that this is something negative for their economy in the longer term. But it should be something more gradual. Or what's happening when Trump was elected, that again, they were not expecting, but it's also this big threat, this big fears around the world also decreasing. We see that the risk has been decreasing. So it's not that it's like the end of the world. They are seeing the reaction. They see that they don't have the chance to being so radical, that they will not, this is not possible, that's not going to be something good to the...
There's one I was just going to, I don't, not really challenge because I don't know, but ask a question. Obviously, I think Peter's right about growth, but that's a headline number. Then within that, you can have growth, as we have had in the US, not strong growth, but growth for a long time, and it's been unequal on an unequal base of income in the first place, and that seems to me you can have the growth, but still you may have those people who are left out. And that sort of makes the growth story slightly less convincing unless you think the growth also decreases income and wealth gaps, and maybe it does over time, or if it's strong enough. I
just need to say at this point that the kind of growth that I'm talking about is indicated inside of numbers that we've seen in the last year, and that is that this is more inclusive growth that we're seeing at the moment. So I apologize for not articulating that.
I think that's an important element of it, because
that's for the first time in 7 years. And so we always see a situation where you see a diversion or a divergence of the wealth allocation during a very stretched period of time. And what I'm saying is, with the world actually coming back, including more in the economy, the growth that we are seeing, the nature of the growth that we are seeing right now, is actually curing that ill.
Right.
Rapidly to answer. Question, will the world get more unstable? Yes. Why? The short-term economic cycle you're talking about. There is what I was referencing to in terms of explosion of communication that throughout history has always led to restructuring at best, wars at worst. So those two coming together, from my perspective, regardless of the recovery, I think we're pretty close to a tipping point, I would say, and I don't know, I don't pretend to know whether we've passed it or not, but I would say that the bringing back into the open, which can be good, of a certain narrative, and let's just call it an anti-narrative, no longer from an economic standpoint and a short-term implication on trade, but from a political economic framework, certainly is very disturbing. And I hesitate and I'm concerned that the recovery will, even if it were excellent, and the best we could imagine, will put this back, an expression, put the dragon back in the cave, or whatever it is. And that's my concern. And I think, especially because of the comfort of folks. I don't know if you saw it earlier, but when you were going through there, you could see this issue of big data and social media. You were making a point, and as we were making it, there was a consensus building. And you guys were changing your results. So they were coming in with a lower, and it was aimed at consensus. It's very interesting because polling of this nature normally is private, but here was a semi-private context. And when we're talking about this dialogue that's not acceptable out there, in Europe and here and so forth, economically speaking, dogmas that suddenly we have to defend in class and with our colleagues and so forth that were widely accepted, that can be expressed. And that, to me, is the concern between these two cycles.
Great, thank you very much. We talked a little bit about growth, and I would like to have ask you another question related to that. It's general. You tell me who wants to start first. The Trump administration wants quick economic growth. The Federal Reserve wants to keep growth under control. Is the Fed being more responsible? What problems come from the White House and Fed having opposing goals?
Oh, let me have fun with that one.
Okay, you
Let me
just
have
go
fun.
for it.
Thank you. Well, I find any question predicated on saying that someone may be less responsible than Donald Trump to be somewhat interesting. But I think, putting aside the specifics, it's a very interesting comment about what you were referring to earlier into what is the maximal, NERA, the maximal employment rate, what are the optimal employment rate, what is proper growth. Economists certainly, we do love to control growth or to argue that we can control cycles. That is, after all, the entire point of our profession. The downside of this is that we believe folks prefer a more stable way of experiencing. We're kind of the Prozac of the macroeconomic world, which is soften everything. That may not be what folks want. And I think it's not a question of what's best or not. I think it's a question of what folks are looking for. Certainly, if we're thinking of an antidote to the severe recession and thinking of an antidote to the anti-discourse, we may want actually from a political economic format to allow a little more growth. So I don't see it as either or, more a question of preferences.
Thank you. Peter, are you in agreement?
No.
No? Please, we like debates here. Go ahead.
I wanted to give somebody else a chance to talk. Really, both are aiming at the same thing. Janet Yellen wants growth as much as Donald Trump wants growth. So it's just a question of how we go about doing that. So if you have an economy that's bumping up against capacity constraints, an economist would say the output gap is 0. And so, now you've got a bit of a problem because, you've got an economy that's chasing after a fixed amount of resources and they're getting thinner and thinner. So they're just going to bid the prices of those limited resources up. And that's what we call inflation. So if inflation starts to take off in the economy and, you have a 4% or a 5% growth rate in the United States, is everybody going to be happy? Well, there's already a job juggernaut going on in the United States. They've had 77 months of successive, impressive job growth. And so, that's a feel-good factor. I don't know why everybody's so angry at this stage of the game because things are in good shape. There's more inclusion that's going on in the economy, just the 7-year wait thing. But, when you look at the capacity utilization in the US and how it's bumping up against constraints, and you look at the fact that, okay, in some way, shape, or form, the job market is being pushed to a bit of a limit. It's forcing companies to get back into things. Well, that's a moment where you would say, my word, the Fed is actually behind the curve. Because normally they would see this coming and they would start lifting interest rates up a little bit more than they've done. Because when you make an interest rate change, it takes 12 to 18 months for that interest rate change to actually have an effect on the real economy. So you've got to be way ahead of the moment when inflation is actually going to occur. So I'm quite worried, actually, that in their dual desire to have strong growth, we actually may be on the precipice of instability, macroeconomic instability on the inflation side of things because the Fed hasn't acted soon enough.
Very rapidly to respond to that, I do think we agree on the fundamentals, but to me, the behavioral economic standpoint here may be useful. We have models that perform well under belly of the curve, expectations about what is optimal employment and so forth. What are these inflection points? I simply do not think they fully capture where we are right now. I think when we've had an event and a correction that was unprecedented in so many decades, that these analytics that are based on 5 or 6 year cycles, I don't think they apply as much. I also think that anyhow, that's probably where looking at those specific numbers is this question of, is that the right, we were talking about this earlier, is this the right regime right now in terms of the analytics to apply to how we're reading these events? And frankly, I would say that traditional economic forecasts have not done that well since the beginning of the...
But that's a really big gamble to take, because if inflation actually does take off, then it's out of the gate, yeah. And it's very hard to tame down after that. So I think it's very interesting to think, okay, well, public perception of interest rate increases as being bad, as a new rule for setting monetary policy, that's a brand new world. And I'm not sure that anybody really wants us to get into a preference-governed monetary policy out there. And by the way, Donald Trump himself does not like low interest rates. He was very explicit about that.
He does now.
But very, very,
Oh, was that today?
yes, at this hour, we're already in a preference influence interest rate environment. I mean, the Fed does look at that. What was I going to say? I lost my track there with that comment. That's fine. I lost.
Well, you've got to juxtapose the preference.
Oh, that's what I remember.
Juxtapose the preference of
thank
low
you
interest
very
rates
much.
with the preference of inflation.
So for me, I don't put it that way. For me, I
Glad I helped you out.
Thank you so much. For me, I see it as runaway inflation is a much more remote consideration. And I do think that if we go from 1, 2 to 3 years, we've been there, we can manage that. We're not in the Weimar Republic overnight. On the other hand, I bring you back to my comment about the anti-sentiment discourse and the need to truly have a sense of the economic benefits. Truly, we want folks to feel it. And that, to me, folks not feeling it, not feeling part of the recovery, both emotionally as well as on the numbers, is something that is more important this time around, given the instability. And you can price the instability as well versus the cost of a few more points in inflation. And I think when looking at the cost of instability at this point with inflation at that point, from a purely economic, not even a social component, I'll take a little more inflation.
We're talking about inflation and trying to find the right level of when is it good, up to what level is it good, up to what level is it not good. Shouldn't we also look at what drives inflation? Is it government induced or Fed Reserve induced? Maybe that's not good. If it's induced by the real economy, it's fine. Do you think this differentiation would make sense?
Well, I mean, I'd believe that the low interest rate environment that we have at the moment is actually monetary policy induced inflation ultimately, because the foot is very firmly on the gas pedal. And so hiking interest rates at the moment is not a punitive measure against the economy. It's taking the foot off the gas pedal. And it's been on there for an awfully long time. And we've gotten inculcated into this low interest rate environment. So yeah, taking the foot off the gas pedal is going to be a bit on the painful side, but it's not like we're talking about jamming the brake on here. Janet Yellen does not want to kill the economy. She does not want to kill the economy, and that's why she is doing a stepwise interest rate increase at the moment. And so in that sense, it's accommodative policy. I mean, that's what I said when I started. She and Trump are trying to achieve the same thing.
Yeah, I fully agree on that.
Thank you with that. Thank you for that. We have a lot of questions around America still, but we have the cocktail hour as well, and our speakers will be with us. So the questions that I can't bring up at this point, you certainly are invited to ask them to our speakers later over a drink. And especially the question around the millennials, which is now driving the new economy and everything, is certainly something that you can bring up. I would like to move on to Latin America a little bit, and my question is to Patricia. It is on Venezuela, or let's start first about, and we haven't touched on that, what about Central America, Costa Rica, and Panama? What do you see, what's the outlook for the growth in 2017?
Yeah, we expect we see a still stronger growth than the average of the region. Yeah, in terms of protectionism, we don't see big changes there. See Panama as an important, still investing a lot in increasing investments there and increasing around 5% a year, still doing better.
Thank you very much. And certainly, one question was, do you insure Venezuela? No, we not at this point.
Definitely not. Yeah.
There was an overarching question to you as well, Patricia. What explains the disparity between Brazil's country risk assessment of C
Yeah.
and the business climate of A4.
Yeah, because there's a difference between the country's assessment and the business climate. The country risk is more associated with macro fundamentals, our payment experience, the fact that the economy was still in recession, live in recession, and this has impacted over activity, and then in the end also in claims ratio. Business climate is more to do about the enforcing contract, the kind of legislation, and all the process of the economy, if it's reliable or not. So different kind of measures.
Thank you. One more for you, Patricia. Yeah. What is your view on foreign investments in Argentina? Is money safer there now more than in the past?
No, sure. Now it's better. In the past, there was always changing the rules and very protectionist government, like what happens if the Spanish Repsol that they decided to say to the company to leave the country because they said that the company was not investing. So they decided to give back to the government. So in the end, it was worse for the economy because they were not investing, didn't have resources to invest, and this was bad for the business climate. And now, no, they are trying to attract investment, and this should be positive.
Great, thank you. Two more questions. One, in general terms, around free trade, and it's addressed to you, Richard. I'll read it to you, and I'm sure we'll have a little discussion around that as well. Do either the UK or the continent really want to undermine free trade in the zone? If not, what does this mean re Article 50 negotiations?
I mean, both will say they don't want to undermine trade, right? But you have a close trade relationship, which the UK has decided to walk away from. And I mean, you know, I'm not knowledgeable about the politics of this whole situation, but I don't see how the EU can give the UK the same kind of trade access. So therefore, by definition, this is going to result in a reduced or more friction, at least, in the trade relationship between the UK and Europe. I think it's inevitable.
Isn't free trade actually a difficult topic to explain to people who fell through the net, through the social net at a certain point? And we know there is always a lost generation that will never catch up.
I think this is the part that the Brexit campaign never dealt with, that actually the left out people, it's the people that Obama never dealt with through 8 years, frankly, the Democrats didn't deal with in their campaign here, who Trump appealed to, though he may or may not help them. I think that's the problem. It's not even that there are certain groups that maybe miss out more than others, but it's just that there are a lot of individuals who see all this talk about free trade and the economy grows, and in aggregate, as the economists like to say, everything is better with free trade, but in pockets it's much worse, and it's really tough for those people. I mean...
Go ahead.
It's interesting, this issue of people left out. In the case of Obama, if you actually look at, if one looks at the numbers, if you look at demographics, the Affordable Care Act significantly helped the folks that in some higher proportion voted for Trump in certain states. So it is interesting how facts can be repackaged and how we live in this alternative reality, truly. I think in the context of Europe, again, I go back to the issue of the underlying numbers. And that's really where I always go back to on that. You were looking at the 20% of the younger folks who, it's the same number, suddenly just came, it's what we've been seeing in Europe for years. We just call it differently over there. It's like clearly the youth organized differently, and suddenly we see it here, and we say, oh, they live with their parents. It's kind of like a softer way to say it, or they're underemployed, they're not unemployed. And I have a good friend who's in that situation, and it's interesting. I was visualizing this and thinking of that, and then thinking of the French elections. in terms of the youth vote. And I was looking at those gaps. There is a very small gap in France in terms of the age and who supports Le Pen. But what surprised me was that there could be one with the youth. And you could see a larger number of French younger folks, up to 21, 22, who support Le Pen. And that, again, should run against our expectation of that. So.
Thank you, Peter. I see your urge. Please, go ahead.
Can't wait to get into
Tell
this.
us.
Well, I'll offer my opinion. Look, we've got to understand, I think, or we've got to make some choices around what it is that people think they've been left behind by. Is it free trade? Well, that's a very convenient enemy. When the chips are down, what are you going to do as a politician? You're going to have to find an enemy to point everything at. And so, Trump would point it at the Democrats, but he would also point internationally. That's a very convenient enemy to have outside of your own borders, and it happens time and time again. It's not just an American thing. It's very convenient everywhere. And so the great crash happens in 2008, and what happens? The greatest beneficiaries of globalization all of a sudden became very protectionist. China had a China first policy. Of all places on the planet, to have a me first policy. Sarkozy was out there saying, French multinationals, if you're going to fire anybody, you're going to have to fire them outside of the country. And it's like, do you get supply chains at all? Anyway, whatever. America had their America First thing as well. It's just a knee-jerk reaction, and it's the wrong enemy. I mean, consider where we are at the moment. We've had decades now of free trade agreements. So this is not theory anymore. And if we've chosen the wrong enemy, and we decide to poke that enemy in the eye, and it backfires on us, okay? So you make a bad situation worse because you've misinterpreted it. Who's going to have to pay for that? Well, individuals themselves are not going to say, well, it's my fault because I made the wrong choice here. They're going to blame leaders and say, you sold me the wrong package. They're just going to go to whoever gives the right answer in an environment like this. So, I think the responsible thing to do inside of this is to tell the story the right way, to understand that it's not free trade, it's not globalization that's the enemy here. Why is that the case? Well, rewind back to 2005, 2006, 2007, 2008. We were at the end of the longest growth cycle in the post-depression period. Globalization and free trade gave us that. So how could we now be saying, well, it's the enemy, when it gave us all of that, gave us some of the lowest unemployment rates that we thought were possible without real wage increases? Okay, so you can't have one, you can't have that, and then now blame everything on it. And we just don't have the facts right. And in this sort of alternative fact, sort of selective, opinion-driven world, we've lost our anchor. We've basically, I'm not going to say it. I can't say this in a room like this, so I'm just going to stop.
Thank you very much. This is a great finale to a really interesting afternoon. I would like to wrap it up with this and have you all ask your questions at the cocktail hour. Thank you very much for coming.